Hello, hello, Year 10. Today we're going to take a look at the structure of DNA and how we can represent it. And from here in a future video, we're going to take a look at the discovery of DNA, okay, which has some interesting history behind it. Okay, so when we kind of think about just where DNA is, all right, a lot of people turn around and say, oh, it's in the nucleus of the cell, all right, but there is more to it, okay? Our DNA is a fairly lengthy molecule. It's actually significantly long in that it is nanometers in length. All right, and if we were to, say, throw a human being in a blender, all right, and then line up all of their DNA after we extracted it from their blended cells and put it end on end, it would actually go to the sun and back from planet Earth multiple times. All right, so that's kind of crazy and insane to think about just how much length there is to these DNA molecules in our body. And of course, they're in pretty much every single one of our cells. All right, here's a little challenge for you. What is the one cell? What is one cell in our body that does not have DNA in it? And why is it a good thing that it doesn't have DNA in it? Put a comment in our Google Classroom answering that and explaining that, and I'll give you a commendation. Alrighty, so basically the idea of where DNA is we have our DNA. It is wrapped around a series of proteins called histones, and those big massive coils of DNA make up our chromosomes. Now in humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which means we have 46 chromosomes in total. All right. And it is that package of chromosomes that can actually be found inside the nucleus of our cells. Now, let's take a little bit of a deeper look at the structure of DNA. And there's quite a few different ways in which DNA itself can be represented. All right. And just from an artistic standpoint, all right, I wanted just to explore a couple of different representations. Okay, so if we take a look here on the left of the screen, we have the kind of classical science textbook representation of DNA, which this is a double helix. If you would imagine a pair of staircases twisted around each other, all right, you're kind of in the ballpark. All right, and what we have is we have highlighted kind of the ladder steps of the staircase of DNA, the pairs of nucleotides. Now, these nucleotides, they make up the parts of the molecule that actually code for the information found within our DNA. We'll get more onto that in later videos. Okay. Now, shown in our second picture just here is a slightly simpler representation of the structure of DNA, but one that I know personally I could actually draw this. All right, I think I would be challenged to draw the first representation. It doesn't show the helix nature of the structure, but it does clearly show the nucleotides, the difference between the nucleotides. It also shows up that those nucleotides are matched up in pairs. Every A goes with a T, every G goes with a C, and so forth. All right. And at the top and bottom, there is 3' and 5' on the left-hand side, and 5' and 3' on the right-hand side. That is actually talking about a direction of the chain based on the direction of molecules in the backbone of the chain. All right. And finally, we have a much more complicated molecular representation. It's, I guess you'd say it's slightly truer to life, although it is still very much a interpretation of the structure. All right, in which case we have the molecular structure of our nucleotide bases. All right, and what we have is we have our sugar backbone. That's the 5-sided pentagon with an oxygen, and our phosphates, that actually the sugar phosphate backbone that runs up either side of the DNA is being represented here. And if you actually have a look at one of those sugars, and I'll just turn annotation on so I can highlight it for us. Okay, so if you have a look at one of those sugars, just here, all right, you can actually see that the carbons, which is what the corners of the geometric shape represent, they represent a carbon. Okay, you can see that they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and the idea of the 3' to 5' direction is actually based on the direction of the carbon atoms coming off that sugar chain. Likewise, if you look over at the chain on this side, you'll actually see that the 3 and the 5 that the phosphates are connected to is actually going the opposite direction. With our structure of DNA, it is important that you are able to represent this as a diagram. And what I suggest you practice in your studies of the structure of DNA is drawing an image like the one shown on the current slide. Okay, this has our nitrogen bases, our nucleotides represented. It has our deoxyribose sugars represented, and it has our phosphates groups as the backbone of the molecule represented as well. All right, now ideally you will have the differences between the nucleotides represented, but as long as you have the letter code on there, that is the important part. Having the little notch or box cut in out of a box would be great, but in a rush, a rectangle with a letter code would be sufficient. Now, the dashed red lines represent what's called a hydrogen bond between those nucleotides. Now, a hydrogen bond is a temporary attraction between covalent bonds. All right, typically they occur with bonds that are between oxygen and hydrogen, or fluorine and hydrogen, or nitrogen and hydrogen. And basically what causes the difference in polarity, so you have unequal sharing of electrons in those bonds, is a difference in electronegativity. Essentially, the oxygen really likes to hold onto those electrons in those bonds. All right, we'll kind of cover more on that when we look at chemistry later in the year. Now, those nitrogen bases, that's where the information is stored in our DNA. All right, they occur in complementary pairs, and the most helpful way to remember that A goes with T and C goes with G is the little saying, at the cricket ground. All right, so it's just, I just remember at the cricket ground, and that just lets me know that A goes with T and C goes with G. Alrighty. So what we're going to do right now is we're actually going to take a little run through of writing down some complementary nucleotide sequences. Okay. Now, what these represent is the other side of the DNA chain. All right. So they're not quite the mirror image, because they are a different nucleotide to the one that is on the other side, but they are like the matching half that meets up with it. Okay, so I'll just turn on annotations. Okay, and what I'm going to do just here is I'm going to do the first 3 or so of these. So if we take a look at this first one just here, all right, we have T, C, G. The complementary nucleotide sequence to that, if we remember that T matches up with A, okay, we have G matching up with C, and C matching up with G. Pretty straightforward, right? Likewise with the second one down here, you would have a T, a G, and a C. And if we run down to our third one just here, we would have a C, a G, and a T. Alrighty. So at this stage right now, what I want to challenge you to do is pause the video for about a minute or so and have a go at doing the other nucleotide sequences, working out the complementary nucleotide sequences for those ones. All right. And then I'm going to challenge you to put your answers for at least one of those sequences as a comment in our Google Classroom. Okay. All right. And if you're able to put one of the 5 correct answers for the remaining sequences, all right, the first 5 people to have at least one correct will get a commendation. All righty. So hit pause and have a go. All right, let's continue on. There's not much longer left in this presentation. Now, finally, I wanted to talk and just very briefly talk about the function of DNA. Okay, there is more to it than this, but this is a good overall high-level explanation. Okay. Now, our DNA contains the plans for our proteins in our body, and most of our body is either made up of protein or it's made up of molecules that are assembled by other proteins in our bodies. Okay. And these materials, they're actually produced from plans in our DNA. Now, the kind of common saying is for our DNA to be thought of as being the blueprint for who we are. All right, and that it's not really a good statement. It kind of just doesn't quite show it. All right, so I would, if I wanted to say it kind of like as a one sentence way of saying it, I would actually say a better metaphor would be the DNA is the plans to build a computer, but also the operating system to run that computer as well. All right, because one of the things that we have learnt over time is that the sections of DNA that do not code for proteins, of which is most of it, all right, are actually really important to regulating when cells turn genes on and turn the production of different proteins on. Okay. All right. So just kind of breaking down the diagram just here, we have DNA. All right. And our DNA is involved in a process called transcription, where a messenger RNA molecule is manufactured from a section, a gene, along one strand. Okay, now that happens in the nucleus. That messenger RNA is fed out of the nucleus, okay, and it runs to a ribosome. All right, now that ribosome carries out another process called translation, where it actually joins amino acids together corresponding to the sequence of nucleotide bases that make up that messenger RNA molecule. All right, and then the cell packages up that protein and either uses it within the cell or sends it outside of the cell. Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward process. We have DNA, and on DNA we have our genes. Those genes are the plans for proteins. Through the process of transcription, we produce messenger RNA. All right, that messenger RNA leaves the nucleus, goes to ribosomes in our cells, and is translated by the ribosomes to produce proteins from amino acids. There is obviously a lot more detail to it, than what I'm just saying just here. And it's really cool how mechanical the whole thing is. All right. But that kind of just gives you a top-down overview of what's going on. And that concept is known as the central dogma of cells. Okay. And it's kind of one of the big concept ideas behind how biology works. All right. And it was a real surprise quite a few years ago when we worked out that some viruses actually do the reverse and they make transcription run backwards, i.e., they take RNA and they produce new genes that is inserted into DNA. That's something we'll talk about later on, however. Alrighty. So, just to finish up, because I love to finish up with a nice picture, this is a sculpture of DNA at UC Davis. Now, I really want to highlight just here that the outer metal rod that's just a spiral is not actually part of DNA. It's just a material to hold up the glass and metal sculpture. All right, it's just there for engineering purposes. It should be ignored in terms of the overall structure of the glass plate DNA. And this runs up a staircase. It's really quite beautiful. I'll see you lot in our next lesson. Thank you for watching. Bye.